morning and welcome to this morning's webinar as part of Health and Safety Month 2021. My name is Kate Harris and I am the Head of Regulated Industries in Health and Safety here at WorkSafe Victoria, and today I'm going to be your host for today's webinar. While our program this year is virtual, much like last year, we have the same aims, which is to keep you up to date and informed on all you need to know around health and safety in your workplace. The theme this year, though, is you learn something new every day. And today, this webinar is going to cover off something that I'm not that familiar with, and I'm hoping I'm going to learn something from. So the topic today is welding fumes, health risk, legal obligations, and controls. So let's introduce the panel for today. So firstly, I'd like to introduce Dr. Tim Driscoll, who is from the Faculty of Medicine and Health at the University of Sydney. Good morning, Tim.
Okay, thanks for having me.
Great to have you here. And also we are joined by Alex Simovsky, who is a peer of mine here at WorkSafe. He is a senior occupational hygienist and an inspector here at WorkSafe. Welcome, Alex.
Good morning, Kate.
Great to have you here also.
Great.
So let's start with you, Tim, first in this conversation that we're going to have around welding fumes. Welding is a common process in many industries, including manufacturing, maintenance, and construction. And I understand welding fumes are classified as carcinogenic, and industries need to understand just how dangerous they can be, which is really the purpose of what we're here to talk about. So, Tim, you're an epidemiologist. Can you outline the health risks from welding fumes for us?
Okay, thanks, Kate. So as you say, welding is actually a common process in industry, and there's probably several 100,000 people in Australia exposed to welding fumes on a regular basis or an occasional basis. In terms of the harms that fumes can do, there are short-term problems like irritation of the eyes and nose and mouth and so on, but can also cause some short-term, quite significant issues in the lung with something like metal fume fever. But long-term issues are probably even more important. And you mentioned cancer, and welding fumes definitely cause lung cancer. They can also cause a scarring or fibrosis of the lung, and they can also cause asthma.
Yeah, wow. So some pretty serious health effects there. So, Alex, can I come to you, given that those serious health effects that can happen from being exposed to welding fumes, it's obviously really important that that medical evidence forms the basis of workplace policies and programs. Can you tell us just what are employers' legal obligations when it comes to welding fumes and controlling that risk?
Thanks, Kate. Exposure to welding fumes is largely covered by the hazardous substances part of the 2017 OHS regulations, and some of the key duties in that piece of legislation include controlling the risk to health, or eliminating or controlling the risk to health, doing some air monitoring and health monitoring in certain circumstances. But of those three duties that I just mentioned, by far the most important one is eliminating or controlling the risk to employees' health.
Yeah, absolutely. Can I stay with you though, Alex? And you're an occupational hygienist, which I mentioned at the beginning, and an inspector with many years of experience in the field. So, I mean, with those obligations you just talked about, what's been your experience? So do you think the level of understanding is high enough with employers?
From my experience, I believe that employers do understand that they have a general duty to employees' health and safety. But I think the problems arise in that there seems to be a lack of understanding in how to go about controlling particular risk, what's available, what's practicable, what will work the best under their certain circumstances. That's, I think, where the lack of knowledge lies.
Okay. Well, hopefully today this webinar is going to close some of those gaps. So, Alex, staying with you still as an inspector, what are you looking for when it comes to welding fumes? When we walk into a workplace, what are inspectors looking for in regards to welding and controlling that risk?
Well, if we're looking at welding specifically, inspectors will look at, what welding processes are in place, what they're welding, how many welders are there, what materials are being welded, how long the welding process takes place. Are they welding for 15 minutes a day on and off, or are they welding for most of the day? What controls are in place and how effective they are. We make observations in terms of the level of fumes that are generated by those processes. We look at whether those fumes are going into the welders' breathing zones or face, if you like. And also we look at where that welding process takes place, whether it's outdoors or it's in restricted or confined spaces. So all those sort of things. Yeah. But the other point that we also look at, besides the specifics of the welding process itself, we also look at how employers involve their employees or welders in coming up with some sort of control strategies, if you like, or ways to mitigate those risks and how they involve their workers.
Thank you, Alex. Really practical perspective there, and one which can really help employers look at their own internal processes. So, Tim, can I come back to you? You talked about some of those mental health, talked about some of those health impacts from welding fumes or associated with welding fumes. I understand they're often latent and can show up years later. Do you see this much in your clinical work? And perhaps could you share with us any examples of cases that you've come across?
Yeah, so that long latent period, so the period between when somebody's exposed and when they get symptoms from it or are diagnosed, that's very important in these long-term welding conditions. So I mentioned lung cancer, for example, and asthma. And if somebody has lung cancer or asthma, it's often not possible to know what caused it. Sometimes with asthma you can tell, but particularly with lung cancer, you can't tell. And because there's that long period of time between exposure and when the condition occurs, people often don't make that connection. So the worker often doesn't make that connection, and the doctor may not make that connection. And that's why a lot of these problems have been under-recognised. And that reinforces the importance of having good control of welding fume and safe work practice, so that exposures can be minimised, because there's no doubt that the lower the exposure, the lower the risk of having these health conditions.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. So, Alex, I'm going to come back to you now and sort of putting us back more in that workplace. Just how would an employer know if they have a problem with welding fumes, or know that they have that risk in their workplace?
I think employers need to look at the same sort of thing that an inspector would look at. In other words, what's the level or concentrations of fumes that are generated, what's in those fumes, and how long are people exposed to those fumes. So it's the same sort of thing. So, if you're looking at, a very small amount of welding, that may not be an issue. However, if people are welding for hours, then certainly that would be an issue that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, okay. And so can I ask a really perhaps simple question? Is it visible? Can you see the welding fumes? Is that one way to know if you've got a problem, or is it not that straightforward?
Thank you, Kate. I've heard a comment made lately for a range of hazards. It is true that when you do arc welding, it generates very small particulates, and if you take it on a particle sort of basis, that if there were one welding fume particle floating around in the air, or a few of them, you wouldn't see them. So if fumes aren't visible, it means that they're in very low concentrations. But as welding operators or employers would know, that as during the day, as people do more and more welding, you tend to notice a bit of a haze. So what that means is those so-called invisible particles tend to build up and scatter the light, and you see them as smoke and fumes and what have you. But I've never come across a welding process an arc welding process that doesn't generate any fumes. And I would suggest that if someone is claiming that there is no visible, you can't see any of the fumes, I'd probably say they haven't turned the welding machine on.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm going to stay with you, Alex. You just mentioned something around air monitoring in certain circumstances. Can you explain when employers would need to do that air monitoring, and actually what does it involve?
Employers are free to do whatever air monitoring they like. However, if employers have a problem, then they should be addressing it and fixing it rather than just doing air monitoring for the sake of it. So the way the legislation is phrased, it says that if there is an exposure standard for the substance that they're monitoring for, in other words, an airborne exposure standards, and there is a reasonable amount of uncertainty whether employees are likely to or not likely to exceed that standard, or whether there's a risk to health, that's when they should be doing some air monitoring. And I think probably the simplest way to explain that. If people, I don't know, do we have any viewers?
We do. We absolutely
just
do.
Chatting? Can anyone put their hands up? No. So just to give you an example, just to illustrate it, if someone's welding, I don't know, 10, 15 minutes a day, just normal MIG welding, nothing too exotic or controversial, then if you're doing that amount of welding, you're very unlikely to set any welding fume standard, if you like. On the other hand, if you're doing 4 hours of actual welding time, that's quite a bit of welding, and I would say you well and truly would exceed a whole lot of relevant standards there, exposure standards, and so the focus should be on controls rather than just doing air monitoring just for the sake of it. However, if you're somewhere in between where you get that in that uncertainty range, you might be welding, I don't know, an hour, 2 hours or something like that, and there is a degree of uncertainty because it depends on a whole lot of circumstances. I think that's where air monitoring would be valuable. But then again, employers do have the option, if they're in that region, rather than spend, I don't know, $3,000, $4,000 for some extensive monitoring, is spend that money on controls and remove any uncertainty. So that's their option.
Yeah, absolutely. And that goes back to your first point around, can we eliminate the hazard, which is always at the top of the hierarchy. So thank you for that, Alex. Tim, hoping you can explain, and some viewers might be aware of this, the International Agency Research on Cancer classification process for welding fumes. So I'm not very familiar with it. And I guess the question here is, what is that classification? Is it based on what type of data? What does it mean? And what would you like to share with us today on that?
Okay, so the International Agency for Research on Cancer, often called IARC, is a World Health Organization agency, and they're basically the world agency that classify exposures as either causing cancer in humans or not. And their classification system, they've got 4 levels. They classify things as definitely causing cancer in humans, probably causing cancer in humans, possibly causing cancer in humans, or there's not enough information to tell. And the way those classifications are made is that each time an exposure is going to be assessed, IARC brings scientists, researchers from around the world, usually to Lyon, where the meeting is held. And the meeting goes for about 7 or 8 days, and they review all the epidemiological evidence, so all the evidence on people, the human evidence, and the laboratory and other mechanistic evidence. And they put all that together to make that final determination about the classification for a particular exposure. Now, for welding, that process went through in, I think it was in 2017, and that showed quite clearly that exposure to welding fumes increases the risk of lung cancer. There was quite a bit of evidence to suggest an increase in the risk of bladder cancer too, but it was felt the evidence wasn't high enough to be sure about that, but it was clear for lung cancer. Now, that, to get to one of your questions, that doesn't mean that everybody who does welding and is exposed to welding fumes will develop lung cancer. Fortunately, that's not the case. But clearly, if you are exposed, it increases the risk. Now, the higher the exposure, the higher the risk, but that's actually got a good side because the reverse is also true, and the lower the exposure, the lower the risk. And that reinforces the importance of having good control measures in place, because the lower the exposure, the lower your risk will be of developing it. So my message on that is, if you're a welder, you shouldn't go to bed at night worried that you're going to get lung cancer. But if you're a welder, what you should be concerned about and focus on is to minimise your exposures as much as possible using the approaches that Alex mentioned before.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. Really, really important message there. And thank you for explaining that sort of piece around that and the connection to the World Health Organization. Can I stay with you? What about your own research? Can you give us any insight into what you're working on and some current research that you'd like to share today?
Yes, well, okay. Almost coincidentally, I've started earlier this year work on a big project on welding fume that's funded by the Centre for Work Health and Safety at Safe Work New South Wales. And I'm working with some colleagues at Curtin University, Lynn Fritchie and Renee Carey and Alison Reid, and the research officer, Camilla Abdallah. And this project's got a number of different parts, but most particularly there'll be a survey coming up very soon of people welding across Australia to find out about the exposures they have and the control measures and their knowledge and so on. We're going to be doing some measurements of welding fume in the workplace because surprisingly there isn't much public information about the levels of those fumes. And then we're going to have some focus groups to look at some of the things that can make control measures easy to use or harder to use. And the final part of that project is to trial an app to improve the level of information and understanding of people undertaking welding to make sure that their control measures are as good as they can be.
Wow, that sounds like a really exciting project. And hopefully in a year's time, we'll be able to perhaps revisit and see how that has progressed. Thank you for that. So, Alex, given the clinical perspective we've just heard from Tim and some of that work in that space, what would you advise employers to be thinking about to control exposure to welding fumes?
Thanks, Ed. Under the hazardous substances regulations, there's a hierarchy of controls that's specified or required to be implemented. Our viewers, if we have any viewers, may be familiar with that hierarchy, and that involves, elimination of the risk, isolations, a substitution, engineering controls, administrative controls, and PPE. So, however, probably a more simplified approach in terms of dealing with welding fumes that might be easier to follow and still consistent with that hierarchy is to first address employees' exposure by looking at the process itself. So employers should be asking themselves, do we really need to do this welding? If you're only doing a little bit of welding, maybe they can purchase prefabricated components and either eliminate or reduce the amount of welding. They need to have a look at the welding process itself, because there's a range of arc welding processes and some generate a lot more fumes than others. So they need to have a look at what's the welding process that will still do the job for them but generates the least amount of fumes, Also, in terms of the setup of that process, I mean, if welders are kneeling down on the floor and doing the welding process, the chances are they're leaning right over it and the fumes are sort of going straight into their face. I mean, set up a workbench or something so that people can work a little bit more upright, and that would also have an impact on their exposure. So if you've sort of looked at that or considered all those options and implemented them as far as practicable, and if exposure is still excessive, because there may be situations where you can't totally control things that way, then you need to look at ventilation controls. So ventilation options include on-tool extractions on the welding gun itself, so it captures the fumes at the source. You've got fixed type ventilation systems, whether it's a booth or a hood or a downdraft table and whatever, that may be suitable in some circumstances where it's limited sort of welding. Or you have flexible type extraction systems and ones you can wheel around the workplace and so on. So once you've implemented that sort of thing, the ventilation controls, and if exposure is still excessive because the work might be quite variable and you can't capture everything, then employers need to turn to respiratory protection, and that can range from anything from particulate type disposable masks to cartridge type masks that fit under the face shield, or a very high level protection type respiratory protection like powered air purifying respirators, which is incorporated as part of the welding shield, and maybe a helmet and maybe just part of the welding shield, but it just puts fresh air in front of the operator, and there's some advantages to that sort of system. So you have to work your way through each of those levels, if you like, to get the most effective outcome. And often you'll need a combination of these measures, that there's, usually not one type of control doesn't fix the whole problem.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. That stepped approach makes a lot of sense. But I guess, could I ask why? It seems like respirators are a pretty straightforward control you could quickly implement and support employees with managing that risk. Why is that not sufficient, though? Why can't we go straight to respirators and that protection you talked about?
Good question, Kate. Respirators do have their place, and particularly, high protection type respirators like powered air purifying respirators. And they may be suitable in some circumstances where you're doing a small amount of work, or it's, you're doing some maintenance and things like that. However, personal protective equipment, which includes respirators, have sort of been put at the bottom of that hierarchy, if you like, for some good reasons. And one of the reasons is that respirators don't capture the fumes at the source and exhaust it somewhere else. They don't remove it from the work environment. So all they do is just form a barrier between yourself and the welding fumes, if you like. So welders will eventually have to remove their mask, and if there's a lot of welding going on in the workplace and there's a lot of welders, the fumes will build up in the workplace and they will breathe in some of those fumes. The other thing is that if employers are just relying on respirators and they haven't reduced the fumes as far as practicable in those other ways that we spoke about, then respirators are uncomfortable, they're not always fitted properly, they're not used properly, they're not worn all the time, there's maintenance issues. So if you get that part wrong and you haven't reduced your exposures through those other means, the consequences are much more serious. Whereas if you've reduced your levels to quite reasonable levels by those other means, and if you don't fit your respirator properly or you haven't worn it for the entire time there, then the consequences and the level of exposure are much lower. So that's the reasoning why that there should be more reliance on those. There should be less reliance on personal protective equipment. Try and minimise your exposure as far as practicable with those other means. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Now, Alex, a couple of times just then you mentioned something that I'm a little bit familiar with, which is so far as is reasonably practicable. But can you put that in sort of layman's terms? What does that mean for an employer? What are we looking for? What would we expect employers to be really considering when they're putting those controls in place?
Well, you certainly know the definition of as far as reasonably practical more than I would probably. But in terms of the welding situation, I guess we'd look at, what welding processes are available and if people can still do the job and choose a process which generates much less fumes, then we would expect employers to move to that welding process. Some of the other aspects is that I guess what is practicable depends on the level or type of risk. I mean, if you've got high risk, there's an expectation that you put more serious controls in place. If it's a more serious risk, if we're talking about, as Tim mentioned, some just basic irritation, then that wouldn't be considered perhaps as big a risk as, say, lung cancer or scarring of the lungs and other sort of issues. So it all depends on that situation. And it also depends on the nature of the work, because if an employer is making the same widgets day in, day out, and you're doing the same thing, it's sort of fairly confined, then that would be easy to control through some sort of extraction system. It's fixed, it stays around. But if your work involves, it's quite varied and involves larger structures and welders are moving around and all that sort of stuff, it's no point putting some flexible extraction hood or something like that, because from my experience, what often happens is that if the work is highly varied and there's a lot of movement required and people have to position it in the right place and move it all the time, those sort of controls will end up in the corner somewhere collecting dust, because it just won't work. So it needs to be something that's workable, it's practicable, and it's effective. So.
Oh, excellent. Well, we've reached the end of our time for questions, and I feel like you both have just beautifully wrapped it up with some key messages there, which is really excellent and an important part. Tim, was there any imparting message or key thing that you wanted to share with the audience today?
I think be aware and don't be scared about it, but just be aware of the issues and do whatever you can to minimise exposure.
Yeah, excellent. And Alex?
Just think of something profound. No. Well, where do I start? Before I get to my message, I guess welding generates very small particulates, and there's gases and vapors and all sorts of things that are generated. And fine particulates or these sort of chemicals that get deep into the lungs, there's not too many things that are good for you, apart from oxygen, I guess, and air and stuff like that. But so you want to minimise your exposure through these high-level controls that we spoke about. But having said that, all these control measures are fine, but I feel that and from my experience in workplaces, is that if you don't involve your welders or your employees in that process in trying to, come up with solutions for that, dealing with the welding fumes, you won't, your control program, if you like, won't be as effective. I mean, involving employees comes up with better solutions that works for everyone, and you get greater buy-in and acceptance. So you don't end up, just throwing ventilation systems and all sorts of things at employees, and nobody really uses them because they're not very practicable and they end up in the corner. So involve employees in that process.
Oh, excellent. Such a powerful message from both of you. One didn't trump the other, but beautifully worked together. So thank you, Alex and Tim. This is where I'm going to say farewell to both of you. Thanks so much for joining us today.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
All right. And I'll also say thank you to you, the audience, for tuning in today for this webinar, and also for all those questions you put through on the system. So WorkSafe is helping to ensure Victorians are safe at work through these tough times in the pandemic. And as you heard today, welding fumes are a really specific hazard that we need to be aware of, as Tim said, not to be afraid of, but really look at our obligations, those health effects, and what you can do practically in your workplace to lower that risk and mitigate exposure to workers. And as Alex pointed out, involving everyone in the conversation can get you the better outcome. So that wraps up our webinar for today. Thanks so much for tuning in. If there's questions or concerns you have, don't hesitate to visit our website or call our advisory line during business hours, or if it's an emergency, after hours as well. And on the screen shortly, there'll be a list of some key information and contacts where you can source some more information, and you might find that helpful. So thanks so much for joining us for today's webinar. Have a great day.